about the Knights Templar tonight and some of their more esoteric history, some of the little-known facts surrounding them that you don't normally hear from historians, and how their influence was huge on what was to become ultimately the Renaissance in Europe, but many other things. So let's just get going, shall we? The first thing that I want to point out is most people know about the exoteric history of the Knights Templar. They were said to be started in 1118. There was a Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a very famous scholar and representative of the church in his day, wrote the Rule, which was the guidelines for the Templars, and made it kind of announced what they were about. In Troyes, France, the Templars were said to have started out with just 9 members for the first 9 years of their existence, and their stated purpose was to guard all the pilgrims in the Holy Land, which would be very hard for 9 people to do. They were granted, right from the beginning, they were granted a place right at where the Dome of the Rock is in Jerusalem, what was believed to be King Solomon's stables at the time. And no one really knows what they were doing for the first 9 years, other than they know there were a lot of digging that they were doing. They appear to be doing a lot of archaeological work, which is kind of unusual in itself because that site at the time was the second most holy site in Islam, and yet here was granted these 9 guys to go start digging there. After 9 years, they started allowing other members in. Their influence began to grow considerably, and their numbers began to grow considerably. They didn't have to answer to anybody other than the Pope. Very shortly thereafter, they set up the first banking systems in Europe, and they worked very closely with what was known as the Cistercian order. And it appears they were bringing over texts that the Cistercian order was translating, and their influence just continued to grow from there. By 1307, there's this period from 1118 to 1307 where they grew, and they had sea captains. Most people don't know when you hear Knights Templar, you just think of crusading knights, but actually they had bankers within them, they had clerics, they had farmers, they had sea captains, and they had an entire building guild of Templar masons. But literally their jobs were to build constructions, where they built over 1,000 different Gothic-style constructions across Europe between 1118 and 1307. And many people believe that they also helped build the cathedrals of France, which we will get into more in a bit. By 1307, there was some jealousy, some people believe, between the King of France and the Vatican at the time, and it was a complicated time. Popes were being executed or assassinated, so that kings could put the pope they want on the throne. The Templars, because they had become bankers and were in charge of all the currency that was being exchanged between different areas of Europe, there were oftentimes kings would borrow money from the Order of the Temple, and of course would be responsible for paying it back later. And the King of France at the time, Philip the Fair, certainly owed the Order of the Templar that he had borrowed. There are many theories on what happened, but basically on Friday, October 13th, agreed upon by the church and King Philip the Fair at the time that all the Templars would be rounded up and accused of heresy, and so all kinds of charges were trumped up, and then they were tortured for 7 years, and by 1314 the Grand Master of the Templars, Jacques de Molay, who's featured here on the left, was burnt at the stake along with the Norman preceptor Geoffrey de Charnay, just outside of Notre Dame Cathedral. And that was considered by most historians, that was the end of the Templar order, though there have been other traditions that have claimed, several other traditions in fact, that have claimed that the order actually secretly continued to exist after 1314. It just went underground and hiding. So that's the kind of the esoteric history of the Knights Templar in a nutshell. What we're going to get into is some of the more secret stuff and some of the things that are, why at the time the church at the time may have been concerned about some of the Templar activities. How was it that they were able to move around in areas of the Middle East and take over these holy sites without anybody attacking them, and some other things like this. So real quick before we move on to that, I'll point out here's Jacques de Molay. In the center here, this was the Templar flag. It was called the Beauseant. And on the right here, this was a pretty standard Templar seal, where it was featured as two knights on one horse. And at the time, the Templars' full name was the Poor Knights of Christ of the Temple of Solomon. And they ended up later being called Knights Templars for short, so, or the Templar Knights, or the Order of the Templar. So that is the kind of the beginning of the esoteric history. So that was 1118 through 1314 is what most historians talk about. So let's go back to the beginning and start talking more about the foundations of this order that really was to become the first multinational corporation. And there's all kinds of conspiracy theories about them and alternative histories that talk about the Templars being involved in all kinds of things. There's myths about how they secretly found the Ark of the Covenant. There's others that talk about how they kept the Holy Grail. We'll talk some about this. There are other traditions that talk about the Templars actually coming over to the New World of the Americas centuries before Columbus. And in fact, there are, to this day, indigenous Native American traditions that talk about this. So there's all kinds of research on some of these topics, but we're just going to touch on some of that. On the left here, this is St. Bernard of Clairvaux, the rule for the Templars. This is, in the center here, this is Hugh de Paynes, who was the first Grand Master of the Knights Templar. And according to some histories, when the Templar order was started, it was actually started by two people, Hugh de Paynes and another guy by the name of Godfrey de Saint Omar. And the legend is that they had both traveled to Constantinople at the time, and they had met with two people who are here on the right. One was the Patriarch Theocles, who was the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church at the time, which was a competing church system from the Roman Catholic Church at the time. The other was a guy, that's right here, this is Theocles. And then this other guy was a guy by the name of Michael Selos, who was a very famous known for translating early Greek texts on alchemy and philosophy and everything else. And it was said that these two people were the ones who initiated Hugh de Paynes and Godfrey de St. Omar and helped give them the mission to secretly start this Templar order. Let's talk a little bit more about what's going on related to these people. There were some interesting things that were happening at this period. The First Crusade had occurred, where Godfrey de Bouillon became the king of Jerusalem, the first stated king of Jerusalem, and we know that Godfrey de Bouillon, prior to becoming king of Jerusalem, had been schooled by a guy by the name of Rashi of Troyes, who was a very famous Kabbalist. And the Kabbalists were and continue to be, a Jewish form of mysticism, in which the Torah is believed to, rather than just being interpreted literally, is a system in which, and we'll get into this more in a minute, but in Hebrew, every Hebrew letter means several different things. It's not like the English alphabet where you just have A, B, C, and that's pretty much all they mean. In Hebrew, every letter corresponds to a number, it corresponds to attributes, and it was believed that the whole Torah was written in a code. And this code alluded to, symbolically, to a language of spiritual connection between the human being and God. And it was believed that there was great power associated with this, not just in because you were talking with God, but because there was, you began to understand how symbols manifest in the cosmos, and how consciousness structured the cosmos, and how you can create order based on them. So we know that Shlomo Yazaki, who is also known as Rashi of Troyes, not only was he an advisor to Godfrey de Bouillon, but he was also a good friend with St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who wrote the original rule of the Templars. And in fact, St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who wrote the rule of the Templars, also created this Cistercian order I was talking about, along with Hugh the Count of Champagne and Peter the Hermit. And Hugh the Count of Champagne was listed as one of the original 9 knights forming the Knights Templar. The first Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Hugh de Paynes, was also the cousin of Catherine de St. Clair, and the St. Clair family, which later was to become the Sinclair family, had a very prominent role in Freemasonry later on. But Catherine de St. Clair was also the cousin of a guy by the name of Chrétien de Troyes. And Chrétien de Troyes is the one who wrote the very first Grail legend, very first legend of the Holy Grail that was ever published in Europe. So that guy just happened to be the cousin of Catherine de St. Clair, who was married to Hugh de Paynes, the first Grand Master of the Knights Templar. Hugh de Paynes, his grandfather, Theobald de Paynes Lamour de Garrier, was also a Moorish Sufi. And we'll talk about the Sufi more soon, but the Sufism is a mystical form of Islam. So we have something very interesting happening at the foundation of this Templar order, which most people consider to be this Christian crusading order, even though what it really started out doing was doing archaeological work in Jerusalem, and the people who started it all had connections with Kabbalists and Jewish and Islamic Sufi, which were both mystical forms of their traditions, which interpreted religious texts symbolically. The other knights who helped start the Templar order also came from what were referred to as Gnostic families in France. And the Gnostics were a Christian form of mysticism within southern France that at the time was kind of the first Protestants in a way. The Roman Catholic Church held the very first crusade was actually held not against Muslims in the Holy Land. It was held against other Christians in Europe, in southern France. There was a group known as the Cathars or the Albigensians that practiced this form of Christian mysticism called Gnosticism, in which they believed that, and we'll talk more about Gnosticism here in a few minutes, but it's worthy to point out that it was the symbolic and mystical form of Christianity at the time. So the people starting the Templar order were all coming from these mystical branches of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And that's very important, and we will explore that further in a few minutes. By 1128, the Council of Troyes was held, and this is where the rule of the Knights Templar was formed, given by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, and it was composed of 72 articles, which was said to be, each article was said to be associated with what were known as the 72 Kabbalistic names of God, according to the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition. So these ideas were the foundation of the Templar order. It's also worthy to note that Hugh de Payne's, his personal shield, his personal blason, was a shield with 3 Moors' heads on it. And later historians tried to say, oh, this was just represented Muslims in the Holy Land whose heads he had chopped off. But that wasn't it at all. He was actually, those 3 Moors' heads were on his personal blason because that was his family tradition. That was his history of this Islamic Sufi tradition. So it paints a very different picture than what normal historians have said concerning the foundation of the order. As I mentioned, the Templars were, the first thing they did was they took over lodging right there at the Dome of the Rock, which at the time was considered the second most holy site in Islam. And at the time, Jerusalem was being controlled by Muslims. So, many people have asked themselves, well, how did they just move in there and start digging there? Right? I mean, why would they have just allowed them to do this? And the answer to this question is, of course, the Templars, we know, had a fatwa from the caliphate that was in Egypt at the time, which is an edict from the head of the Islamic empire at the time, granting the Knights Templar permission to have that spot and start digging there. And again, that changes a lot of perspectives as well on what the Templars were doing, because clearly they weren't just crusaders down there defending Christianity and fighting Muslims. If the Muslims were the ones actually granting them the license to be there, so to speak, and the first Grand Master came from the Sufi family. But there are other examples of this through medieval chronicles. For example, in the year 1190, there was a medieval document that was published called the Order of Chivalry. That was actually written in 1250, but it refers to, in 1190, the Knights Templar initiating Saladin into the Templar order. And Saladin was the head of the Islamic armies at the time in the Islamic world. And yet here's this medieval record of the Knights Templar initiating the head of the Islamic armies into the Templar order. So again, these are things that don't go very well with the idea that the Templars were just a crusading order, you know. There are also numerous accounts from the period of the Templars protecting all pilgrims in Jerusalem, regardless of what faith they were coming from. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim worshippers. In fact, here's one I like to point out. It says, in the annals of the history of the Crusades in Jerusalem, records the story of a young Frankish knight entering the Dome of the Rock and being met with a Muslim praying towards Mecca. Losing his temper, he intimidated the Muslim who was praying, quote unquote, the wrong way. The Frankish knight then found himself taken to task by two Knights Templar who ordered him out of the holy precinct and told him not to come back until he had learned manners and tolerance. The Templars then, on behalf of the expulsed knight, apologized to the Muslim for the Frank's misgiving attitude, ignoring the directives from Rome. The Templars gave all Muslims and Jews the right to pray as Muslims and Jews in Jerusalem. So this, again, goes against the idea that they were just going in there to attack Muslims. So there was a lot more going on with what they were doing. And to emphasize this fact, I've spent a lot of time in Istanbul, which was formerly Constantinople, and now you all can get the song out of your head related to that. But in the former Templar commandery that's there in Istanbul, which was their commandery building and was said to be the place that Hugh de Paynes and Godfrey de St. Omar were actually initiated initially. So they resided in this place from the full 1118 until 1314 when the order was suppressed. This is the place, and it used to be called the Little Hagia Sophia Church, or actually used to be called it's now called the Little Hagia Sophia Mosque, but it used to be called the Church of St. Sergius and Bacchus. It's still there in Constantinople. It's since been converted into a mosque, but there's a couple interesting things about it. You know, the Muslims preserved a lot of the character of the original building. The original building was built like a giant beehive, and it has, even on the prayer turret here, they still have honeycomb, carved, because that's the way the floor and the ceiling all was this honeycomb to make it look like a giant beehive. And underneath this former Templar commandery building, there's a crypt, and I've been down there. And there are Templar graves down there. And here are a few of the headstones from it. And some of the and they're all Templar tombs that are down underneath it. But some of them are in Latin, some of them are in Greek, some of them are in Hebrew, and some of them are in Arabic. And it's because they were all Templars of different religious traditions that were practicing together and working inside this former Templar commandery, to the point that they're all buried together still down under the crypt, which is really something. And people still of religious persuasion still aren't buried together in most cemeteries around the world. And here were Templars clear back in as early as the late 1100s that were all from different religious backgrounds that were being buried together. Only a few hundred years later, Christopher Columbus was taken before the Inquisition because he dared to suggest that one of the star patterns he saw looked like a Jewish menorah. So the fact that here these people were doing this at this very early stage is, it's really quite something. So anyhow, that secret crypt is still down there. And in fact, I just visited it about 2 weeks ago. There are also Jewish traditions. I'm talking traditional Jewish traditions, sources that talk about that the Knights Templar discovered two principal Jewish texts, Kabbalistic texts in the Holy Lands. They were doing their archaeological digging there. And these texts relate to the Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical system. And these are all the names of several different, Kabbalistic texts. But according to some traditional Jewish sources, there were two texts in particular that were said to have been discovered by the Knights Templar and then given to Jewish communities in Spain to translate and make available. These are called the Sefer HaBahir, and the other is called the Zohar, which just means the Book of Splendor. And these were these two books were, along with the Sefer Yetzirah, considered the three foundational Kabbalistic texts within the Jewish tradition. So let's talk about Kabbalah just for a minute. Since we had at the founding of the Templar Order, we had Rashi, who was the advisor to St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who composed the 72 articles of the Templar Rule, which were said to correspond to the 72 Kabbalistic names of God. And we have the Templars being credited with finding these two Kabbalistic texts in the Holy Land and bringing them back to Jewish communities in Spain. So what is Kabbalah? As I mentioned, Kabbalah is a system of analysis of the Torah and other Kabbalistic texts in which it's believed that the Hebrew alphabet literally is composed of the utterances of the words of God in creation. And that these utterances manifested as light in the world, which then condensed into matter. And that therefore every letter was deemed to be a powerful creative utterance from the mind of God. And therefore it's said to have certain attributes, some of which are, for example, the letter A, or Aleph in Hebrew, also corresponds to the number 1. It's said to have the power of an ox. It's said to be associated with the element of air. Just as an example, you can go through the whole alphabet this way. And so early Jewish Kabbalists said, look, the whole Torah is written in code, and you're not going to understand it unless you understand this code. Later Christian Kabbalists and Gnostics interpreted the same thing for the New Testament. So let me give you an example. There are 22 Hebrew letters, just like there are 22 bones in the human head. And the 22nd letter is Tav, which just means cross in Hebrew. Okay? Tav is composed of 3 of the Hebrew letter Vav, which means hook or nail in Hebrew. So at the end of the Hebrew alphabet, you have a cross and 3 nails, which completes the alphabet, and it forms the 22nd letter, which was also traditionally in Kabbalistic circles associated with the skull, because it had 22 bones. These are the exact same symbols we find associated with the crucifixion in Christianity. And so, the early Christian Kabbalists said, look, this is symbolic. There may have been a crucifixion or whatever, but what is written in the Bible is symbolic. And not only that, but the Hebrew letter Vau, so there's 3 of the Hebrew letter Vau in that cross. Hebrew letter Vau has a numeric value of 6. So you have 3 vowels, it's 666, which is a number of transformation in early Kabbalistic circles. It had nothing to do with the devil. So these were all the types of codes that were said to be contained in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And it appears that the Templars, amongst others, were studying these things and coming to their own conclusions. One of the things that was dangerous about this way of thinking was that if a person could begin to understand the codes of the Bible and interpret them for themselves, you don't necessarily need an intermediary to pray for you between you and God. And that's a very profitable thing, to be that intermediary, right? So that was threatening to the religious power structures of the day. And some people feel this is really the reason why the Templars were suppressed, was because they were starting to spread these ideas that they were uniting from across the Middle East. We'll talk about that more. The Kabbalists also, they said all creation goes back to this diagram, which was called the Tree of Life. It was also called Jacob's Ladder. It was also called the Face of God. It was a diagram composed of 10 what were called emanations of God, or attributes of God, and 22 paths connecting these attributes, each of which corresponded to one of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, forming 32 combinations in all, with a hidden 33rd. And to move up, it was believed that a person started out at the bottom of this diagram and through their own efforts crossed 3 levels or 3 degrees to eventually move into mastership within the Kabbalistic system. And these were arranged on what were called 3 pillars that were designated by the attributes of wisdom, strength, and beauty, and that there was a hidden 33rd attribute. And these things have resonance within our current Masonic system within Freemasonry today. But this was kind of the origin of some of that. It's also worthy to note that this diagram was also said to be, within the Zohar, said to be associated with a sacred chalice. This is kind of the diagram related to that. And from the Zohar, from the very first page of the Zohar, this Kabbalistic text, it says, "And this secret is written about in the verse, I will raise up the cup of salvation, for this is the cup of benediction that is raised after the meal. The cup of benediction must rest on 5 fingers and no more, just as the lily rests on 5 rigid leaves that represent the 5 fingers. And this lily is the cup of benediction." It's kind of cryptic, right? But the point is, it alludes to this Kabbalistic tradition as the cup of benediction, which of course, within the Western mythos, became associated with the Holy Grail. We'll talk more about that in a minute. This diagram is also the foundation of the symbol of what's known as the Cross of Lorraine, which is a cross with 3 horizontal bars, which were said to correspond to these 3 levels that the person had to, as they moved up the middle pillar, they had to cross. And by the way, each of the Hebrew letters, as I said, had different attributes. And these 3 traditional Kabbalistic traditions, these 3 steps corresponded to the Hebrew letters Mem, Aleph, and Shin, which represented water, air, and fire, respectively. So the person had to go through these symbolic attributes of these elements, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay, so what's interesting about this is, in the Grail legends of the Middle Ages, one of the earliest Grail legends was written by a man by the name of Wolfram von Eschenbach, and it was a book called Parsifal. And it talked about, amongst other things, how the Knights Templar guarded the Holy Grail. And it was first published in Toledo, Spain, by the same publisher that published the Zohar for the first time, this Kabbalistic text. And what's interesting to note is on this Kabbalistic tree, this diagram, this right here, one of the names for this diagram is called Pursuf, which just means face. And if you add the article for God on the end of that, which is El in Hebrew, you get Parsufel, which is, of course, the name Parsifal, the hero of the Grail legends, which attains this cup of benediction, the Holy Grail. So, and there are other correlations between what was described in these early Grail legends from the 1200s and what we find in these Kabbalistic texts. For example, when the Templars were suppressed and they were being persecuted, one of the things that they were accused of worshiping was a three-faced idol, or a three-head idol. And in the Kabbalistic text of the Zohar, it actually describes this Kabbalistic diagram, which represents the consciousness of God as it manifests in the universe, as a three-headed or three-faced diagram. In fact, in the Zohar, it says there are three upper heads, two and one which contains them. So this is describing this Kabbalistic diagram. And this is, of course, what the Templars were accused of worshiping as well. So these are some of these Kabbalistic correspondences that most historians don't look at. But there's some other interesting things associated with these early Kabbalistic texts. One is in the Zohar. Now keep in mind, this was a text that the Templars were said to dig up in Jerusalem. They probably knew where to dig because of Rashi of Troyes. And then it was published, it was given to Jewish communities in Spain, published it at the same time they published Parsifal, and which was in the 1200s, okay? So long before Columbus. But in the Zohar, it describes some interesting things. It says there are 7 continents, and that the earth is round, and that the earth goes around the sun. In a section called the Vayikra, the Zohar describes that the earth rolls as a ball, so that while some are on top, others are down. And while for some people the sun shines, and for others it is dark. And there's a place where there is daylight all the time, except for a little time of darkness during the day. The Zohar also says that there are 7 continents. One of them is not populated. These are all later things that were supposed to be discovered after Columbus, right? After he proved that the earth was round. Yet here it is in a text that was being published, a Hebrew Kabbalistic text that was supposedly discovered by the Templars and published in the 1200s for the first time. And it's interesting to note that after the Templars were suppressed, again, they had a whole fleet of ships and sea captains that disappeared at their suppression. But there were some areas in which the Templars just changed their name in Europe. Like in Portugal, they changed their name to the Knights of Christ and were never persecuted. And out of the Knights of Christ came all of these early sea navigator explorers. For example, Rabbi Abraham Zacuto, who studied the Zohar and is known for his Kabbalistic studies, was actually an advisor to Christopher Columbus. And Christopher Columbus's father-in-law belonged to the Knights of Christ, this Templar order that had continued to survive within Portugal. And his father was a sea navigator, he was a sea captain. And Christopher Columbus inherited all of his old maps. This is what has led some to believe that, the Templars had a much bigger knowledge of how the world worked and were sailing all over the place. That, and there are legends from indigenous tribes going all the way down to Panama describing what appear to be Templars coming over and doing early trading with them long before Columbus. Rabbi Abraham Zacuto was also the one who advised King Manuel I of Portugal to send Vasco da Gama on his historic journey around Africa, and he also guided Vasco da Gama and prepared him for his famous journey. Vasco da Gama himself also belonged to the Knights of Christ, just like Christopher Columbus's father-in-law was. So it appears that a lot of this navigation stuff was inherited by the Templars, and some of it was coming from these early Kabbalistic texts that were published long before Columbus. Okay, so that's the first kind of Kabbalistic tradition that we find associated with the Templars. The second is there's a Hermetic tradition. And the Hermetic tradition is a tradition that is said to go back to this Greek figure known as Hermes, or Hermes Trismegistus, who in Greek mythology was said to be the inventor of writing. He was said to be the messenger of the gods. He was said to be in charge of currency and medicine and all kinds of other stuff, but there was belief that there was a philosopher, or a philosopher king, if you will, a person who actually lived on earth, who went by the name of Hermes Trismegistus, or Hermes the thrice illustrious, or thrice great, who was named after the god himself. But this character of Hermes is also found in the Egyptian Tahuti or Thoth, or Thoth, depending on how you want to pronounce the Egyptian. He was also associated with the Roman Mercury, the Sumerian Enki, the Phoenician Tuat, the Norse Wotan. And we know that there were certain groups in the Middle East that venerated Hermes in Hermetic philosophy, one of which is known as the Druze, who we'll talk more about in a minute. And the other is a group known as the Sabaeans. In both these groups, we know that the Templars were in contact with, and I'll show you information related to that soon. In the Quran, the Sabaeans are mentioned as the people of the book. And the people of the book in the Quran are Jews, Christians, Muslims, and Sabaeans. And everyone's heard of Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and very few people know who the Sabaeans are. The Sabaeans were said to come out of Iran, which was southern Turkey. It would be now southern Turkey. And they were said to worship Hermes as a god. And so the early Muslims just said, look, tone down the paganism a little bit. Just call Hermes Idris. And it'll be cool. And so they said, okay, no problem. So they started worshiping Idris, which was one of the prophets of the Quran. It was associated with Enoch in the Bible. So they said this was Hermes. But Hermes is also found in, he was first really known of in Europe because there was a text known as the Corpus Hermeticum, that was said to be discovered in the 1400s after the Templars, which talked about Hermetic philosophy. And at the time, people were amazed because there was so much in these Hermetic texts that were similar to what was in the Bible. And consequently, there was a guy in 1666 that said, oh, well, this is just proof that it was all stolen from the Bible. And even though the Hermetic texts say they went back to ancient Egypt. And of course, this expert was saying this 200 years before Egyptian hieroglyphs were translated. So since then, we now know that actually a lot of the things that are in these early Hermetic texts were also found on ancient Egyptian temple walls and the ancient Egyptian papyrus, which does suggest that this Hermetic tradition does go back to ancient Egypt. And they were also found in there's a series of apocryphal texts or biblical texts that were discovered only about 50 years ago, buried out in the desert of Egypt, called the Nag-Hammadi Library. These were discovered in these clay pots, just like the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they have a number of alternative testaments to the Bible that didn't get included in the standard canon we think of today. And one of the testaments is called actually Codex 4 of the Nag-Hammadi Library, and what it is a doctrine of Hermes, which shows that these early Christians were actually studying Hermetic philosophy. And this is of interest to people who study some of these alternative philosophies and histories, in which it appears the Templars were. And it's of interest to Freemasons because one of the characters that's a focal point within Masonic ritual is a character known as Hiram, or Hiram Abiff. And it just so happens that Hiram in Hebrew is Hermes in Greek. So the main character of Freemasonry is actually Hermes, and I'll be showing that more in a little bit later. So, but we also find Hermes showing up in this early Grail romance known as Percival, where we have these other Kabbalistic ideas. In Percival, there's a character who's kind of this Merlin character that helps the Grail hero along his quest. And his name is Trevisrit, the Hermit. And the word hermit just comes from the word Hermes. And Trevisrit means threefold knower. So this character that helps the Grail champion along throughout this early story of Percival to help him discover the Grail, which is guarded by the Knights Templar. It's all written in the 1200s. Is Trevisrit the Hermit, or Hermes the threefold knower, Hermes Trismegistus. And the basic philosophy behind the Hermetic philosophy could be summed up as above, so below. As within, so without. And of course, the Grail legends talk about how the Grail King received this horrible wound, which caused the land to suffer. And the only way the land could be healed is if the bishop king that got wounded is healed by the Grail. So again, it's as within, so without. As above, so below. And this is exactly what the theme of the Grail legends is, and it's all tied back into this Trevisrit the Hermit. But this same philosophy is also found in the Kabbalistic text of the Zohar. In the Zohar it says, everything is connected with everything, right through to the nethermost end of all the links of the chain. And the true essence of God is both above and below, in the heavens and on earth, and nothing exists apart from it. So this is both Kabbalistic philosophy and Hermetic philosophy. And you need to understand that the Hermeticists believed that and we're going to get deep here for a second, so bear with me. If we haven't gotten deep already, right? The Hermeticists believed that all reality, they said if God is the creator of everything, and God is all that is, the only way that God can create, because there's nothing outside of him, the only way that he can create is within his own mind. And therefore, everything that we think is real and solid, everything else, is just the mind stuff of God. And it all exists within the mind of God. Kind of freaky, right? Kind of matrixy. But that's exactly what the Hermeticists said. And they said it was all created through a word, just like, or an utterance. And the Kabbalists said the same thing, just like we find in the beginning of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word. And that this word, this utterance, this vibration is what brought about all of creation. And it was referred to as the lost word in Hermetic texts and in Kabbalistic texts. And that's a theme that shows up in Freemasonry as well. So, Hermes was said to be the propounder of this philosophy, and his school of thought was known as Hermeticism. He also was said to have written a tablet known as the Emerald Tablet of Hermes, which was said to be an instruction for how to create what was known as the Philosopher's Stone, which was this thing in alchemy that could heal the body, cause the mind to have this incredible awakening where it perceived more than most people. It could connect with the mind of God. It was said to be able to turn lead into gold. And this was something that was, according to tradition, alchemical tradition, this emerald tablet, which was where the instructions of Hermes, was buried with Hermes in his grave, that was his tomb, which was supposedly discovered by Alexander the Great in Siwa, Egypt. And Aristotle helped Alexander the Great translate the Emerald Tablet. It was also said to be possessed by a philosopher. It was said to be a contemporary of Jesus by the name of Apollonius of Tyana, which some people believe was actually the Apostle Paul, and that the word Apollonius, which just means little son or little Apollo, just got shortened to Paul. But that he was also said to have this tablet, and that there have been many famous people, including many famous scientists throughout history, that have tried to translate this Emerald Tablet and believe that there's great secrets behind it. This is, in fact, Sir Isaac Newton's translation of the Emerald Tablet from 1680. And it starts out saying, basically, it's in older English, I'll paraphrase it in modern English. It says, true without lying, certain and most true, that which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below, to accomplish the miracles of the one thing. And as all things were born and arose from the one mind, through the meditation of the one, so all things have their birth from this one thing by adaptation. So here we're talking about the one mind that all things came out of, through the meditation of God. And it says, its father is the sun, its mother is the moon. The wind carries it in its belly, and its earth is the nurse. And it goes on and talks about it, then it says, hence I'm called Hermes Trismegistus, having the three parts of wisdom of the whole world. That's what that which I have to say concerning the operation of the sun is accomplished. So it's this very cryptic thing, right? But many people throughout history have studied it and thought that it had incredible philosophy. Interestingly, some traditions have even gone so far as to say that in the Torah, when Moses came down with the tablets, it talks about how he actually came down originally with a set of tablets that he broke because he didn't think the people were ready for him yet. He saw people worshiping a golden calf, and he said, screw this, we're not going to give this to these people because they're not ready for it. So he broke them. And then he gave them the next set of tablets, which were the moral instruction. But some people have suggested that this first set of tablets were even this emerald tablet, these types of instructions. So interesting things. This is part of what the traditions have talked about. And we have to talk about, where did this tradition come from? Oh, and by the way, we also find again, I'm going to go back to the Grail legends, because it talks about the Templars and it talks about this science of alchemy as well, which was said to be connected with Hermeticism. So from Parsival it says, it's talking about the Holy Grail, and it says, the Grail is well known to me. Many formidable fighting men dwell in Mount Salvage, which means the mountain of salvation, with the Grail. They are continually riding out in sorties in quest of adventure. Whether these same Templars reach trouble or renown, they bear it for their sins. So it's referring to the Templars as the Grail Guardians. It says, a warlike company lives there. I will tell you how they are nourished. They live from a stone whose essence is most pure. If you've never heard of it, I shall name it for you here. It's called Lapsit Excellis. By virtue of this stone, the phoenix is burned to ashes, in which he is reborn. Thus does the phoenix molt its feathers, which done it shines dazzling bright and lovely as before. Further, however ill a mortal may be from the day in which he sees the stone, he cannot die for that week, nor does he lose his color. For if anyone, maid or man, were to look at the Grail for 200 years, you would have to admit that his color was as fresh as in his early prime, except that his hair was gray. Such powers does the stone confer on mortal men, that their flesh and bones are made young again. This stone is also called the Grail. So here it's describing the Grail as what was later to be known as the Philosopher's Stone, which is associated with this phoenix that could die and be reborn, and it all had to do with this Hermetic science that went back to this emerald tablet and how to create the Philosopher's Stone. So we see it from the earliest times, the 1200s. The earliest Grail legends are associating the Holy Grail with alchemy, Hermeticism, Kabbalah, and the Knights Templar. And by the way, it also talks about Percival's brother, half-brother. And his half-brother came from a Muslim woman. His dad had 2 wives, one in Europe and one in the Holy Land. And so he was married to a Christian woman in the Europe, and he was married to a Muslim woman in the Holy Land. And this was Percival's half-brother. So the guy who was to become the Grail King in the legends, not only is he getting the Grail from the Templars, but there's Christian, Jewish, and Muslim influences related to the story, and the mystical influences, just like we see at the foundation of the Templar Order. We also see other things within the early Templar tradition, for example, related to alchemy. For example, in 1245, William de Saugnac became the Grand Master of the Templar Order in Jerusalem. Later in 1247, this Grand Master, William de Saugnac, sent a distinguished Knight Templar delegation to England in order to present King Henry III a portion of the blood of our Lord, which he shed to the cross for the salvation of the planet, enclosed in a handsome crystalline vessel. The relic was authenticated beneath the seal from the Patriarch of Jerusalem, the bishops, abbots, and nobles of the Holy Land. This sacred vessel was called the chalice of the rose cross, which will become important later. And it was said to contain a rare hermetic and alchemical elixir, which was called the blood of Christ. So they didn't think it was actually the blood of Jesus. The blood of Christ was said to be this part of this philosopher's stone, which was said to look and taste like blood. It's also referred to as the red lion. This vessel passed in the possession of King Henry IV, King of Navarre, and the vessel and its contents were later deposited in the Cathedral Church of St. Paul. So this is one of those early episodes where the Templars were said to be dabbling in alchemy. There are lots of others. We know that the Templars also invented early forms of antibiotics. They were using mold extracts to heal infections in their hospitals. They also invented CPR, believing that the word for breath and the word for soul in most ancient languages is the same word. And so there was a breath that if a person died and the soul left the body, if you were to artificially stimulate breathing, that the person would take in breaths and that their soul would go back in them and they'd come back alive. And so this was the origin of CPR. But it all went back to these alchemical doctrines and Kabbalistic doctrines and Hermetic doctrines. So I now want to talk about the Templar rule from the 1240s, so that the rule changed over time. I mean, this was the guide, this was the bylaws of this was the Book of Constitutions of the Templar order. And there's a Templar rule from 1240, and it says in Article 8, it says, "There are elected brothers and consoled brothers throughout the world. Where you see tall buildings built, make the signs of recognition, and you will find many righteous men with knowledge of God and the great art. They have received it from their fathers and masters and are all brothers. Among them are the good men of Toulouse, the poor of Lyon, the Albigensi, those near Verona, Bergamo, the Baholi of Galicia and Tuscany, the Magyars and Bulgarians. You will lead them to your chapters by underground passages, and for those who are fearful, you will give them the consolamentum outside the chapter before 3 witnesses." And then in Article 9 it says, "You will see fraternally the brothers of these groups, and in the same way the consoled of Spain and Cyprus will fraternally receive the Saracens, the Druze, and those who live in Lebanon." So let's talk about this now, because it has profound implications. All of these groups that are mentioned in this Templar rule all belong to Gnostic communities. The Gnostics, as I alluded to quickly previously, were people who studied the Hermetic texts and who believed that the sacred texts were all written in symbolic language designed to bring about personal revelation of God without the intervention of a priest. Extreme heresy, right? In fact, the early church did the first crusade against the Albigensians, who were mentioned in this Templar rule. And the original 9 knights, most of them came from these Albigensian families. The Bulgarians, for example, that are mentioned there were a group of Gnostics known as the Bogomils that were in Bulgaria. We know that the Bulgarians were translating alchemical doctrines, and they were also sharing texts with the Albigensians who were in southern France at the time. The Druze in Lebanon were another Gnostic group that we're going to talk more about here in just a minute. When I say the word Gnostic, it comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. But it doesn't mean knowledge in the mundane sense of like, we normally when we hear knowledge, we think of book knowledge, right? We think of studying something and then we get knowledge from it. But the word gnosis implied more of an experiential divine knowledge. A direct knowledge from God. The word gnosis within the Western tradition is very similar to what we find in the Eastern tradition with words like enlightenment and nirvana. Only in the Western tradition it's referred to as gnosis. It was believed by the Gnostics that the early New Testament was all written in this symbolic initiatic code that was related to this coming to, through purifications, coming to this awakening of gnosis. And so the Gnostics actually set up a series of initiations and baptisms designed to bring about this awakening. And they had baptisms associated with water, air, and fire. Just like we find within the Kabbalistic tradition. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. And this thing called the consolamentum, that we find in the Templar rule, the origin of that is with the Gnostics. And it was a rite that was given to people to ensure that after they received the consolamentum, that they no longer had to reincarnate anymore unless they wanted to. Because the Gnostics believed in reincarnation as well. They believed that people it took many lives to go through a series of purifications to come to this gnosis, this divine revelation. And they believed that it was described and mentioned in the New Testament. In fact, they often pointed to the part in where the disciples go to Jesus and they say, I can't remember which gospel it's in, but they go to Jesus and they say, Jesus, the people are saying that the prophet Elias has come back. And Jesus says to them, he has come back, but the people don't recognize him yet. And it says, and then the disciples understood that he was talking about John the Baptist. With the implication that John the Baptist was the reincarnation of the prophet Elias. Which is not what's normally taught in churches. But that's certainly what the Gnostics believed. So, this is found in the Templar rule of 1240. And it's talking about the special relationship with all of these Gnostic groups. So is there any other evidence that the early Templars had these Gnostic associations? Well, in fact, there are. The first is that this is one of the early Templar seals, which features this crazy looking figure on here that was known by the Gnostics as being called a Braxis. And what it is it's this figure with snake legs and an apron, and he's holding a whip, and he has a rooster head, and there are 7 stars, and there are these letters, iota, alpha, and omega, or I, A, and O, in it. And we find this seal on Templar documents. We also find it carved on the initiation chamber of the floor of the Templar castle at Acre in Israel. And this was a Gnostic talisman. This figure, Abraxas, was said to be the son of Sophia. And Sophia was said to be wisdom. And according to the Gnostic mythos, Sophia was the bride of Christ. It was represented by Mary Magdalene on this planet. And that Sophia, or wisdom, really represented the human soul. And that the Christ, or the Christos, was the universal consciousness connected with God. and that this human soul, or Sophia, had to wed the Christos, or the consciousness of God, in order to attain gnosis, or divine knowledge. And they said that, the Gnostics said that Jesus represented this Christos, and that Mary Magdalene represented the Sophia, and that the wedding of Cana represented this marriage, symbolically, and it was supposed to be Jesus and Mary Magdalene getting married, which has led to all kinds of weird conspiracy theories about the bloodline of Jesus and everything else. It's part of what Dave Brown writes about, right? But to the Gnostics, it was all symbolic. This Sophia was said to have 4 children, according to the Gnostic tradition. The first was Abraxas, and he represented the path of initiation, which we'll talk about in a minute. The other 3 children were named Faith, Hope, and Charity. And these were the 3 children of Sophia, and of course we find Paul talking about these things, you know, faith, hope, and charity. And many people believe, the Gnostics believe Paul was actually a Gnostic. This is why he's experienced Christ as a vision of light on the road to Damascus. Because the Gnostics referred to themselves as the religion of light. They also referred to themselves as the sons of the widow, the sons of light, and other ideas related to this Sophia. All right, so let's talk about Abraxas here. Let's first talk about the Gnostic stages of initiation. So the Gnostics said all of humanity could be divided according to the 4 classical elements: earth, water, air, and fire. And these corresponded to psychological states in people. Earth was associated with people who were totally obsessed with their physical senses and composed, 80 to 85% of the population of the world. They said these were people who all they thought about was the next titillation and the next bowel movement. That's about it. And it's kind of sad, but that's what they said. They also referred to them as the profane, or the hylix. And they said that in order to begin the path towards gnosis, you had to be initiated. And the first initiation was that by water. And water was said to be associated with the emotions, with the passions. And they said you had to learn to subdue your passions during this time. And they said the metaphors associated with it were walking on water and related to baptism by water. And these people who had mastered this were known as the psychics or the hearers within different Gnostic traditions. The next stage then was associated with air. The early word for air was also spirit, or spiritus, also meant air. And these people were called the Pneumatics. It was associated with the mind. And these people had to learn to study what were later to be called the 7 liberal arts and sciences. And this was the 2nd degree of initiation. And it was believed that these people began to study the world, not to prove how smart they were and to be really good at Trivial Pursuit, but rather it was believed that if they developed the mind and began to study these things in nature, that they would come to understand that they were all part of a greater mind, God. That there was a greater order behind creation. And this was the first step towards seeing glimpses of the gnosis. Between this air stage and the fire stage, the Gnostics usually required the candidate to go through a symbolic death, where they symbolically killed them and then raised them back to life. And when they did so, they were given secret grips, secret words. They were shown secret gestures with the hands and the feet that were all designed to help the person ascend the spheres towards gnosis. And gnosis was associated with fire or the light of the illumination of consciousness. Now, what does this have to do with Abraxas? So this was the Gnostic tradition. By the way, they looked at passages in the Bible as being related to this. For example, Jesus said, "Those who came before me baptized with water and air, spiritus. I've come to baptize with fire." They saw this as alluding to this degree system of taking people out of the earth and putting them through these three degrees of illumination. And the Apostle Paul said he experienced Christ as a vision of light and was taken up to the third heaven. They said this was alluding to the 30-degree system of illumination. They said the story of Noah's Ark was alluding to this. That in the story of Noah's Ark, you have the earth obsessed with its physical senses, and then what happens? Along comes a flood, baptism by water. And then Noah lets birds go into the air that gives him certain knowledge. And then he lands on earth and makes a burnt sacrifice to God. Like he lands on Mount Ararat, which Ararat in Sanskrit means illuminated one, right? Literally means one who has attained gnosis. So the Gnostics saw this as, these were all stories and metaphors related to attaining this process. And they saw this figure of Abraxas as representing this. The snake legs represented, what does a snake do? It crawls on the earth, right? It's close to the earth. The apron represented the first stage of initiation. It hung in the area of the bowels, where all the liquid functions of the body take place, water. He's holding a whip in his hand, and the whip cracks in the air, associated with the air. He has the rooster head. What does the rooster do? He sees the light of the new day. He calls out. This was the call out to gnosis, to the new light, about illumination. And then these 7 stars represented the 7 planets. They also said to represent 7 centers within the human body that needed to become activated before gaining illumination. Just like within the Eastern traditions, they have what are called the 7 chakra, which represent the exact same thing. And the Gnostics believe these also corresponded to what were referred to as the 7 seals in Revelations, before Revelations. These 7 seals had to be opened, and that when each seal was opened, it represented the one death of the old self and an awakening to the new perception of the world. So they saw Revelations not as the end of the world, but rather the symbolic end of our perceptions of the world and the awakening, the revelation to a new perception of the world. Very profound, cool stuff. But this was all the stuff that the Templars were beginning to study and incorporate clearly within their system. All right. So where did they get this from? We know that they came from Albigensian families and Sufi families, which were practicing all of these Gnostic philosophies. But by the Templars' own account and their rule, they talked about associating with this group known as the Druze in Lebanon. And the Druze are still in Lebanon. They are a Gnostic tradition in Lebanon. I was just meeting with them a couple days ago while I was in Lebanon. They are, this is their symbol, which if you turn that basically upside down, it becomes the symbol of the Eastern Star in Freemasonry. And that's because Morris, who created the Eastern Star tradition in Freemasonry, he also wrote a book called Journey to the Holy Land that talks about his journeys over to the Holy Land where he encountered Druze. that's where he got the symbol from. But the Druze, according to their own account, they say that there were certain souls who came to Egypt in antiquity, and that these souls developed the arts and sciences that would lead to gnosis. And they incorporated these arts and sciences inside two hollow pillars, one to withstand fire, one to withstand water, and that they adopted the symbol of the blazing five-pointed star as the symbol that represented gnosis, and it also represented the 5 points of their doctrine of how gnosis manifests, and the 5 what are referred to within the Druze tradition as the 5 points of fellowship. And the Druze adopted initiation rites, they adopted secret grips. The Druze are very private. They say they were the builders of King Solomon's temple. They say they were they venerate Hermes as a prophet. They also venerate Pythagoras as a prophet. And we know that the Knights Templar were associating with them because their own Templar rule says they were. And to this day, you meet with the Druze and they say, oh yeah, they have a whole tradition associated with the Templars. Now, it just so happens that the Druze have they have a secret grip that is the same grip as what's found in the 3rd degree of Freemasonry. I'm not going to tell you what it is. It's a public lecture. But it's the exact same grip. But within the, when you go to places like Lebanon, when you're meeting with the sheikhs, when you see a sheikh, in order to give this grip, you extend your hand and they put a sacred cloth over your hands. And you give the grip. And the word you say in Arabic to the sheikh is Wahhabin, which in Arabic means welcome to the loving place. Okay? It comes from the word Wahaba, which means in Arabic means loving, or to love. And so this is in the Druze tradition, this is the standard greeting. They have a number of historical traditions about their connections with the Knights Templar. The Druze are considered Gnostic Unitarians because they adapt very well with lots of different religions, because they believe that at the foundation of all religions was this gnosis. Like somebody had this divine revelation, this gnosis, and that person became a prophet that started that religion. And so they tend to interpret religious texts symbolically. They also adopt the customs and the outward tradition of whatever country they live in. And consequently, they're the only religion outside of Judaism that's allowed to serve in the Israeli military. Because they're very close. There's a lot of Druze in Israel. There's also a lot of Druze in Syria, in Lebanon, in Egypt, and actually Nigeria, surprisingly. That's a more recent phenomenon. But the Druze, what's interesting as far as Freemasons go, is that there's a lot of similarities between the Druze and Freemasonry. And there's no way you can explain how this private group in the Middle East has these traditions that we also find developing in Scotland years later without the intervention of somebody who was traveling between the two places, between Scotland, where Freemasonry first came out, and the Middle East, Lebanon. And the only people that were doing this at the time were the Knights Templar. So we're going to explore that theme a little bit more as we go on. By the way, the Druze refer to themselves as Tawhid. The name Druze was actually given to them by Muslims several hundred years ago because they had a leader named Al-Darazi, and so the Muslims called them Druze. But actually, amongst themselves, they refer to themselves as Al-Tawhid, which just means the oneness of being. And according to the Druze, they also teach that all reality was formed by this word of creation that came out. Just like as in the Hermetic tradition, just like as in the Gnostic tradition, and the Kabbalistic tradition, and found in the Gospel of John. So that's kind of interesting. The Druze also believed in reincarnation, just like other early Gnostic traditions did. And so that's the Druze. And we'll talk more about them later. Another group that we know that the Templars were associated with was a group known as the Sufi. The Sufi are, we know that, again, Hugh de Paynes, who was the first Grand Master of the Templars, his grandfather was a Sufi, came from the Sufi tradition. He had more Sufi heads painted on his blazon for this reason, because it represented his family line. The Sufi, again, they're Gnostics, but they're Islamic Gnostics, and they interpret the Quran symbolically along with the Bible and the Torah. And these are the dervishes of the Sufi tradition. And they have some very interesting ceremonies. Their meeting groups are called tekkes. And the tekkes, in the tekkes, they begin by, when the Sufi enter their tekkes, they kind of spiral in and they lay a lamb skin in the east of the tekke. The Masons recognize as the lodge hall. They lay a lamb skin there, which represents the unknown master that they're all becoming. They bow to this lamb skin as they enter into the temple. And then they have three principal officers, one in the east, one in the south, one in the west. And they're opening, they light a candle in the center of the room, and they talk about the position of the sun at different periods of the day, and the glory of that as they're opening. And then the dervishes will actually do a dance where they do this spinning motion, where they try to get into a trance in order to attain this gnosis. And they're trying to connect with the universal order that spins. Everything rotates. And when they do this, they put one hand up and one hand down, representing as above, so below. And they go into this spinning motion. Now the Sufi have certain signs and certain forms of recognition. For example, some of their signs are, in their tekkes, the first is called the Si sign, which is this. The second is called the Sa sign, which is this. The third is called the So sign, which is this. And these three signs correspond to what we believe is the sacred vowels of A, I, A, and O. Just like we find on that Templar seal. And that they believe that these are the sacred vowels that comprise the name of God. And in fact, they also have a secret form of recognition where if you see a Sufi do this, it represents the Latin letter I and a point becoming a line. So you do this, they'll then do this, which represents the Latin letter A and also a set of compasses. And then you do this, or then they'll do this, which represents the Latin letter O, and also a point within a circle that the compasses form. They said that this is the secret to creation. The this is part of their secret rituals. The Sufi have 3 degrees. The first degree is associated with the left breast. The second is associated with the right breast. And the third degree is associated with meditational exercises in the center of the breast. They wear these funny hats, which represent Islamic tombstones, because they say they have symbolically died to this world and been raised to a new light of gnosis. And these are all elements that we later find within Freemasonry. But it's interesting that we find it in these earliest Sufi traditions that the Templars were connected with. Now, the Sufi and the Druze were also known for translating alchemical texts, particularly early Greek and Egyptian alchemical texts from Alexandria. And so these are some examples of that. And that, they're the ones who brought these texts back, started translating them, and making them available. But they weren't available in Europe at the time. They're only available amongst these communities in the Middle East. And yet, and here's some of these early Sufi and Druze texts alluding to these alchemical ideas. And you see the sun and the moon and everything else. So, what's really interesting is we find these alchemical ideas in the Middle East. At the same time, they start showing up in very strange places in Europe. For example, this is an alchemical manuscript down here on the left. Alexandrian alchemical manuscript that was being translated by the Druze in Lebanon. And it shows a maze on it, which is called the Labyrinth of Solomon. And guess where the first place this maze shows up in Europe? On the floor of Chartres Cathedral in France. This is the origin of this from this alchemical manuscript. Or, for example, there was a very famous alchemist in the Middle Ages named Raymond Lully. For those of you who are Albert Pike fans, he writes about Raymond Lully quite a bit in Walls and Dogma. But this is one of Raymond Lully's medieval diagrams from the 1200s. And many people believe Raymond Lully was actually a Templar. This is the Islamic original of that same alchemical diagram. This is where they were getting it from. So these things were being translated by these secret Gnostic societies in the Middle East, and then somehow showing up in Europe on these weird places. Now what's interesting is, even in the alchemical manuscripts from the 1500s, when they talk about the origins of the alchemical science, here you can see this listing of all the early alchemists that helped bring the alchemical science to Europe. And a lot of them have this word Arab after them. And it's because these were Arab alchemists. They called them Arab alchemists, but they were actually Sufi and Druze that were translating these things. Except for the very first one here listed, which lists Michael Selos, who was the guy who was said to have initiated human beings and got rid of St. Omar in Constantinople, started the Templar movement. So, pretty interesting. But, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, how it relates to Masonry, because in the Rule of the Templars from 1268, it says, no brother should ever swear when angry or calm, nor should he ever say an ugly or vile word, even less do such a thing. Each brother is required to do all noble actions and say all good words. Also, no brother should wear leather gloves except for the chaplain brothers, who are permitted to wear them in honor of our Lord's body, which they often hold in their hands. And the Templar Mason brothers may wear them sometimes, but they should not wear them when not in work. So here it says that the only people that are allowed to wear these white leather gloves at the time, according to the Templar rule, were the Masons, the Mason Templars, who were in charge of building these structures, and the priests that were in charge of serving the sacrament. Now, we know there were two main building guilds that were responsible for building the cathedrals of France. And these building guilds were known as the Children of Solomon and the Children of the Master Jacques. And by both of their accounts, they say that they originally came from the building guilds of the Knights Templar. The Children of Solomon just came from the Children of the Poor Knights of Christ of the Temple of Solomon, which is the full name for the Templars. And the Children of the Master Jacques said that the Master Jacques was Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, who was burnt at the stake. That's where they got their name. And these were the people that were said of building these cathedrals. And there are certain signatures within these cathedrals which are very interesting that carry over to this day. The first is, for example, at Chartres Cathedral, where I just showed you the labyrinth. In Chartres Cathedral, there's a window that's dedicated to Saint Apollo. Well, that's kind of weird. Because Apollo was the sun god, right? And yet here he is being listed as a saint in this cathedral. And in this window dedicated to Saint Apollo, there's a little hole in the glass. And on the floor of the cathedral, the entire cathedral is tiled with the stones going one direction, except for one stone. And this one stone has a brass peg in it. And on St. John the Baptist Day, June 24th, a beam of light comes in through that hole of St. Apollo and hits that brass peg on the floor of the cathedral. So this Chartres Cathedral was dedicated to St. John the Baptist, which later became important to Freemasons. St. John the Baptist Day is the day that when the Grand Lodge of England first announced itself in Freemasonry in 1717, it was on St. John the Baptist Day. In the Grail legends, it talks about when the Holy Grail appears, it appears over this stone, and on the stone appears this message that says, if any Templar should become ruler of a foreign community, let him ensure that they are given their God-given rights. It's the first time in medieval history where it says that people are born with God-given rights. Traditionally, the right either came from the king or from the pope. This is saying that people are born with God-given rights. And of course, this idea later shows up in the American Revolution. It just so happens that July 4th, according to the new calendar, was June 24th, according to the old calendar, which was St. John the Baptist Day. So we know the Declaration of Independence was actually signed on July 2nd. So why did they choose July 4th as Independence Day? Some people think it was because of this same Templar tradition, going back to John the Baptist. It shows up again and again and again. But there are other things in these cathedrals. There's astrological knowledge that's showing up. There's alchemical knowledge associated with the sun and the moon, the Emerald Tablet, and the Master, the hand of the Master. At Notre Dame Cathedral, for example, carved on the front of the Notre Dame Cathedral, right before you even go in Paris, are all the stages of alchemy being depicted. In fact, this is a figure holding a shield with a salamander on it that's on fire. The reason why that's there is that the alchemists and the Hermeticists and the Gnostics, they played with Greek words. And the word salamander can come from the Greek word sal, meaning salt, and mandra, meaning stable. And they knew that in order to get to the stable salts in alchemy, they had to calcine it down in the fire. They didn't actually believe that lizards lived in the fire, right? This is being depicted on the front of the cathedral, right? Which, you know, most people think the cathedral is just images from the Bible. You can find a salamander in the Bible, you're not going to find it. Here's a figure with the wings and the caduceus of Hermes. Well, here's Hermes being depicted on the front of Notre Dame Cathedral. Here's Hermes being depicted in the cathedral in Vienna. Again, figure not in the Bible, but here he is being depicted. The same Hermes that developed the Hermetic philosophy that's found in the Grail legends, the same Hermes that's venerated by the Druze in Lebanon. On the roof of Notre Dame Cathedral is this guy, which is an alchemist in his Phrygian alchemy hat, looking down over the cathedral. It's the highest point of the cathedral. It's not Jesus, it's an alchemist looking down over the cathedral. And there's other alchemical symbols like that was associated with alchemy, like the pelican pecking his own breast. Pelican was the name of an alchemical vessel during the Middle Ages. This is at the Cathedral of Amiens. You see this figure carved holding what was known as an Athenor oven, which is an alchemical oven, and pulling out of the base of it a salamander. It's being carved in the cathedral. So these early Templar stonemasons were incorporating and showing aspects of this alchemical art which were not in alchemical texts in Europe during the day. They're only found in alchemical texts that were being translated in the Middle East by these Druze and these Sufi. So the only way they could have showed up on these cathedrals is if the Templars were associating with these groups, gaining this knowledge, and then incorporating it onto the cathedrals themselves. This same knowledge had to go into the creation of the stained glass windows that are found in these cathedrals, which had to be made using metallic oxides. You had to have a knowledge of metallurgy to be able to do, which was associated with alchemy. And the things they depicted on these stained glass windows, like this is a Chartres cathedral, and these are all of the zodiacal signs. Here's Virgo, Sagittarius. You know, knowledge that we don't normally associate with the Bible necessarily. They also carved things like Melchizedek at Chartres holding the Grail with a stone in it. Melchizedek, of course, was associated with being the first initiator in the Bible. He was said to initiate Abram. And after he initiated Abram changed his name to Abraham. And he initiated him with a communion of bread and wine. You also have people like Pythagoras carved on Chartres Cathedral. And the only people at the time that were preserving Pythagorean texts were the Druze in Lebanon. So the people that were carving these things had to have had these associations. And the only people associating with them, according to the Druze account and the Templar account, were the Templars. All right. So this alchemy, this theme of alchemy, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, and Kabbalah. Everyone still with me? We're covering a lot of history here. We have just a little bit more to go. These people were, these philosophies are what led to the Renaissance in Europe. And the philosophies of alchemy, for example, are what later were to become chemistry. Alchemistry just became chemistry. Things like astrology just became astronomy. And, these were the, these were some of the foundations. And people like, we know like people like, for example, Leonardo da Vinci mentions Hermes in his notebooks. People like Botticelli and Leonardo da Vinci and others were all schooled by an alchemist by the name of Verrocchio, who was in Italy at the time. He was studying all this information that had been brought over by the Templars. So there were legends that the Templars went underground after they were suppressed. They didn't really die out. One legend was that they fled to Scotland. One legend is that they fled to Germany. Another legend is that they fled to Switzerland. We know that they went to Portugal and just changed their name. We also know that there was a whole group of Templars who fled Europe and just converted to Islam and became Sufis that were in Spain at the time. So again, clearly showing that there were these early associations that, and by the way, part of the reason why the Templars were so friendly with Islam is that the Templar Gnostics believed, one of the things they looked to as a metaphor was the story of Plato's cave. In the story of Plato's cave, it's an allegory. Plato says, imagine there's a bunch of people that were born into this world chained to the wall inside of a cave. And they grow up just seeing the wall of this cave. And that behind them there's light coming in, and there may be shadows on the wall of activity happening behind them. But because they're chained just looking at the cave, all they think, when they see the shadows, they think that's reality. That would be their reality growing up. And every once in a while, one of them would be freed, and they would go outside and realize they were this whole other world, and they would come back and tell everybody, and everyone would think they were nuts. And he said, this is what's happening with Gnosis. That there's this whole other reality, and what we're seeing here in this world is just a shadow reality. But there's a whole consciousness behind it, and once you wake up to that, you're going to see a whole different world. So they use the awakening from the cave as a metaphor, and they believed that the story of Jesus being born in a cave, in the manger, one of the early stories was in a cave, and that later the cave or the tomb is declared empty. The Gnostics believed that the revelation, or the resurrection of Jesus is actually a metaphor to the awakening to Gnosis, because the Greek word is anastasis, that is normally interpreted as resurrection. And anastasis just means to wake up. And so to the Gnostics, this was waking up to Gnosis, that the tomb being declared empty by Mary Magdalene, this represented the Sophia, the soul, being awakened to the consciousness of God, Christos, and realizing that the tomb, or the cave, which represented the physical body, wasn't real, that it was empty. that the true light was something bigger. This is how the Gnostics interpreted it. So when the Quran says that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, and that the people were taken in by an appearance, they believed, and that because Muhammad was said to have attained this revelation from Gabriel in a cave, and then he revealed the Quran, they saw the Quran as an early Gnostic document. And that the fact that the Quran mentions groups like the Sabians and calls them part of the book, and the Sabians venerated Hermes, and that there were other things in the Quran that came from Kabbalistic traditions. They said it was an initiatic document that was meant to be only understood by Gnostics. That's what the Sufis said as well. And hence, the Sufis are widely persecuted in the Islamic world. But this was the origin. So, it was believed that the Templars were passing on this information. This brings us to the 1500s, right? There's this belief that they went underground, they helped shape the Renaissance. And then in the late 1500s, there was this group in Germany that published a text called the Neometria, which just means the measurement of the temple. And this text was dedicated to a group called the Militia Crucifera Evangelica. And we know who this Militia Evangelica group is. This is one of their secret churches. Kind of a cool symbol on the door handle, right? And here's where they're buried. And they have all these Templar crosses on the walls, and they have Non Nobis Domine, which was the Templar motto around the graves. And they were in this area of Tübingen, Germany. And this is the Neometria, which was written in 1598, published in 1604. Neometria means measurement of the temple. What it is it's a 2,000-page book describing King Solomon's temple and all the symbolic aspects of it. And it says that all of these symbolic aspects correspond to Kabbalistic, Gnostic, Hermetic, and alchemical wisdom. Right? This information was, and it also says that Frederick, the Duke of Württemberg, was the Grand Master of this tradition, and that Queen Elizabeth I of England was a member of this tradition. Okay, this is Frederick here. And out of this tradition, there was a student, Simon Studia, who wrote this Neometria by the name of Johann Valentin Andrea. This is his coat of arms in Germany. And Johann Valentin Andrea was the first person to write what were known as the Rosicrucian Manifestos. And this was the birth of a movement called Rosicrucianism out of Germany. Now what's interesting is at the same time, which is we're talking early 1600s. And by the way, Andrea in German just means Andrew in English. So this is one of Andrea's books. Interestingly, he depicts the three-faced idol that the Templars were accused of worshiping. This is Tübingen. This is his house, Andrea's house, where there's some interesting rooms with carvings of the Holy Grail on them. His mother, Maria Andrea, was the town alchemist in Tübingen, or in Kopf, which is just really close to Tübingen. And the Stift in Tübingen is where the Rosicrucian Manifestos were first written by Andrea. And this is really where the Rosicrucian movement started. In the Rosicrucian manifestos, they describe the symbolic philosophies of a Christian Rosicrucian who's described as wearing this white tunic with a red cross on the shoulder, just like the Templars had, and having a hat where he puts some roses in it. And we know that there's a town right nearby to all of this. There's a place called Tynak. And in Tynak, there's a secret chapel that Frederick the Duke of Württemberg had created. And in this chapel, there's this hidden painting. And this painting depicts all the things from the Neometria. And we know that Johann Valentin Andrea was the advisor on the painting. And it's the earliest painting to depict King Solomon's temple with a checkered pavement. It depicts Princess Antonia, who was Frederick's daughter, as an initiate, being initiated through this painting. And she's holding things like the flaming heart, the anchor with the laurels, and the lamb, which represent faith, hope, and charity. Again, the children of Sophia. And Princess Antonia throughout this painting is depicted as the Sophia, being initiated and moving through the painting, through King Solomon's temple, to eventually reintegrate and marry the Christos and attain gnosis, which was a heretical idea at the time. Throughout it, we have things like King Solomon. We also have Nicholas Flamel depicted in it. He was a very famous alchemist back in the day, with the Grail and the Philosopher's Stone. We have Pythagoras depicted, early depiction of Pythagoras. Is the earliest depiction of King Solomon's temple with the twin pillars, Jachin and Boaz, and a checkered pavement. And here we see Princess Antonia and Sophia standing on the moon and united with Christ, representing the sun. So we have the sun and the moon being harmonized. There's alchemical knowledge. Here's the symbol of the squared circle with the eye of the triangle, which became associated with the Militia Crucifera, the Angelica, which is also the doorknobs of this place. And then we find things like the Yud and the triangle, which later became associated with the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, and a number of other things. But it's all, the whole painting set up Kabbalistically and alchemically. And this was the foundation of what was to become known as this Rosicrucian movement in Germany. Now, meanwhile, in Scotland, there were some interesting things going on, because in England, there was Queen Elizabeth, we know as early as 1803, held a ball where she designated costumes that she had Indigo Jones design, who was the person who designed all of the costumes for William Shakespeare, for the Globe Theatre. And these costumes were called a Rosicrucian, or a Rosicrucian Knight. This was prior to the Rosicrucian manifestos coming out. So we know Queen Elizabeth had to have been associating with Frederick, just like the early Neometria says. And we have a tradition within a Templar tradition pointing to early Scotland, where it talks about the persecution. There's a charter that people have theorized on its legitimacy, but it was supposedly written as Jacques Molay was in the dungeon. And it talks about what the Templars are supposed to do, and who the next Grand Master is going to be. And one of the things it talks about at the time is these Scotch Templar deserters. It talks about these Templars that fled to Scotland, and rather than staying behind in France to help fight. and it ends the document with "so mote me." It's the earliest reference to this term, "so mote me," which later shows up in Freemasonry. But within the Scottish Freemasonic tradition, within the Royal Order of Scotland, within other traditions, they do talk about these Templars that fled to Scotland and helped to form what was to become known as Freemasonry. So not only do we find these early origins within the Templar origins within the Rosicrucian tradition, but we also find it within the Scottish and English traditions. Believed that people like Sir Francis Bacon were largely involved in it. We know that Francis Bacon, for example, was very close with Johann Valentin Andrea, who was said to have written these things. And then we find things like Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, which you'll find Masonic historians who will debate whether Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, which is also mentioned in Dan Brown's book, had any association with the Templars at all. But we find things within the Rosslyn Chapel that are carved, like, for example, here's a Knight Templar. It's hard to see his cross on his neck, or on his tunic. He's holding this rope that's around the neck of a candidate who's blindfolded. He was being led between two pillars, which becomes an important aspect of Freemasonry later on. We also find within Rosslyn Chapel these angels that are carved playing instruments, and above them are these cubes with these funny geometric patterns on them. And forever people didn't know what this was, until they realized that they could figure out which notes that the angels were playing. And then above them were these shapes. And what these shapes are, that are on these cubes, are what we now know as somatic music designs, which is, if you were to take a drum and sprinkle sand on it and play the vibration of a sound through it, the sand organizes itself into geometric patterns. And to the early philosophers, this was proof that in the beginning was a word or a vibration that gave birth to geometry, that built the crystalline forms that we find behind nature. So it was proof that there was God. And so we find these same geometric patterns that we know are related to these music notes carved in Rosslyn Chapel. Rosslyn Chapel was completed in 1420, which was 400 years before this idea of somatics was rediscovered in Europe, and yet here it is carved. And there's only one other building in the world where these designs are also carved, and it's of the former Templar commandery in Istanbul. They're carved on the ceiling, which is really something, right? And it's proof that there was this connection between the Templars and Rosslyn Chapel and the former Templar commander in Istanbul, around Constantinople. It's also interesting to note, like I said, this former Templar commandery was built like a giant beehive. This is actually the building from the outside. It's also interesting to note at Rosslyn Chapel, on the roof of Rosslyn Chapel is the earliest known working beehive that was incorporated into the architecture of Rosslyn Chapel. And the beehive is also the personal blazon symbol of St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who wrote the rule for the Templars. Here is the original Templar commandery in Constantinople, and this is Templar Church in London, which was modeled after the Templar commandery in Constantinople. So the last thing I'm going to point out is early Freemasonry. Because the two earliest documents associated with Freemasonry, The first one's called the Gothic manuscript, and is said to be from the late 1300s. So remember, the Templars were suppressed in 1314, all right? There's legends they spread to Scotland, we know places like England, and we know that they were associated with the Druze that have this legend about how they originally, souls came to Egypt and incorporated this knowledge inside two hollow pillars, one to withstand fire, one to withstand water, and then they adopted the blazing five-supported star as for gnosis. They agreed to reincarnate and teach people this gnosis throughout history. Well, the earliest manuscript associated with Freemasonry, which is from the late 1300s, which is called the Gothic manuscript, is talking about the founding of the two pillars of Freemasonry. It says the one, and it refers to them as stone pillars or stones. And it says the one stone, and the reason why they refer to it as stones is because the early Greek word for pillar was hermi, which was associated with Hermes. And it was said that they were, Hermes were pillars that had stones on top of them that alluded to Hermes' philosophy, which was as above, so below. So, it says the one stone was called marble that cannot burn with fire, and the other was called laterus that cannot drown with water. Our intent is now to tell you truly and in what manner these stones were found whereupon these crafts were written in Greek. Hermes was the son of Cush, and Cush was the son under Shem, who was the son under Noah. And this same Hermes was afterwards called Hermes, the father of wise men. And he found the two pillars of stone, wherein the sciences were written, and taught them forth. So the earliest document associated with Freemasonry says the foundation of Freemasonry came from Hermes. Just like the Druze say. Just like they talk, same thing, talking about these two pillars. One associated with fire, one associated with water. I think it's a coincidence. This is how it manifested. That this secret society in the Middle East during the Middle Ages were teaching something that just happened to show up in Scotland in this medieval manuscript. The only way that would be possible is if the Templars were bringing it over. So this is the Gothic manuscript. The other earliest document of Freemasonry is called the Shaw Statutes. And this was written in 1598, 1599, right before the Rosicrucian Manifestos came out. And in the Shaw Statutes, it talks about Masonry of Scotland. It talks about what are referred to as penal signs and penalties, which all had alchemical meaning according to the Shaw Statutes. And it says the purpose of Freemasonry was to teach what was called the Hermetic art of memory. It's what the second oldest Masonic manuscript teaches. It says it's to learn the Hermetic art of memory. So the two earliest documents of Freemasonry, it's mentioning Hermes and Hermetic aspects. The character of Hiram, or Hiram Abiff, later shows up in Freemasonry in the mid-1700s, and is put there by a guy by the name of Jean Theophilus de Zagalier, which I'll say that 3 times fast. And he was a known alchemist. He was the second Grand Master under the Grand Lodge of England. He helped Anderson write Anderson's Constitutions of Masonry. And he was best friends with Sir Isaac Newton. And they used to study and practice alchemy together. And they studied Hermetic philosophy. So he was the one who put Hiram in there, which just again, Hiram in Hebrew is Hermes in Greek, which is Hermes. And was trying to preserve this Hermetic tradition where The earliest reference we find it is in the Grail legends of Percival, associated with the Templars, and with the Druze in the Middle East who venerated Hermes. So, there's our journey, right? The implications of this are that the Templars brought over far more knowledge than people widely acknowledge, and that these philosophies of Gnosticism, Kabbalah, Hermeticism, alchemy, all continue to exist today within Freemasonry. And they were a fundamental part of early Rosicrucianism, and the only way they could have come into Europe and been adopted at an early time is through this Templar connection. Therefore, it's my conclusion that you cannot understand the origins of Freemasonry without understanding this Templar connection. So, hence one of the great mysteries of Freemasonry.